Jackie, it's 1997 and you're my girlfriend. I know your dad hates me because I pierced my ears with a drift chisel from shop class and stole his fishing weights to gauge them bigger, but I just got a Ford Probe. I'm gonna make money as a street racer. Do you know how much power these makes? It's a lot. Wanna go for a ride? I know you're about to make excuses, but I'm too full of insecurity to accept a no from a woman. I promise I won't drive fast. I promise I won't drive fast. I promise. I promise I won't drive fast. I'm lying. I promise I won't drive fast. See? We're going slow. We're going slow. It's nice and easy. It's nice and easy. I lied. Are you scared? I'm just as fast as a Honda Prelude. I'm just as fast as a Honda Prelude.
Today's episode of Regular Car Reviews is sponsored by Factor. Man, you guys, I love you guys. I keep making dick jokes and you keep giving me food and Factor are fresh, never frozen meals, dietitian approved, and they're ready in minutes. Awesome. Oh, we're making a whole bunch of We're working on new uncensored RCR videos. More on that later in the rest of this video. And our new podcast, Regular Friends. So I've been working a lot. Every single hour of the day counts. And you need nutrition. Oh, Factor is good. Hold on. Head to factor75.com and use code 50regular, or you can click the link below, it's right below. Factor75.com, click the link below, use code 50regular. 50 regular. That gets you 50% off and free shipping on your first Factor box. How cool is that? Wait, cold pressed juice. They also got cold pressed juice. And these things legitimately have no sugar in them. It probes me with pleasure. And now, back to a Ford Probe.
1997 Ford Probe GT. Blair, did you know that the Ford Probe was supposed to replace the Mustang? Okay, Boomer, relax. And that was a Gen 1 probe, not the second gen, which is what this is. But comparing the front-wheel drive 4 or 6-cylinder probe to the rear-wheel drive V8 Mustang is stupid. The probe is better compared to the 4th or maybe 5th gen Honda Prelude, in that the probe ate the Prelude's crumbs. Eager buyers who wanted the Prelude but were denied by the VTEC tax shuffled down the Lehigh Valley Auto Mile to a Ford dealership and self-hypnotized themselves that the cheaper, slower, and less powerful probe was better. And they did this by saying, Jackie, it has a V6. If I get the GT, it'll have a V6. The Prelude only has a 4-cylinder, and the Probe has a V6. It's more cylinders, more better, because it's better.
I made the right choice.
I put a cold air intake on my Ford Probe GT. Okay, Tyler. You did, despite your misuse of shop tools, you did route a cold air intake, the box at 10 horsepower, correctly. See? The piping goes down, not up. You did it right. It's drawing air from where the air is cold, below the engine. But it's missing a rain shield, which is a curved piece of metal which protects the cotton, sponge, or paper-based filter element from water spray when you drive in the wet. K&N filters don't work, but in this instance, if you're running an open filter exposed to the rain and the mud and the salt, it does make sense to use one that you can wash, clean, and reuse. The second-gen Ford Probe GT was Ford's Mazda cosplay car to cash in on the new tuner scene, which wasn't interested in the antiquated Windsor V8 in the Fox body, or the new modular 4.6-liter V8 in everything. This styling was peak 90s. Find a hard line on this car anywhere, and there's no idealized past with the Ford Probe GT. It doesn't look back to any old design. It is fresh, it's modern, it's new. There's no member berries here. It's truly a unique car. It's like the whole car was designed using only the ellipse tool in Photoshop. But that's interesting because the designers, Jack Telnack and Mimi van der Molen, they did older cars as well and sort of retro cars, but that all was toned down here, or not existent at all. This is the aero style. Mustang drivers weren't ready for this aero style yet, but their kids certainly were. And curves like that are what you get everywhere on the Probe. The only square parts are the headlights, and even they hide away. The engine, yes. The V6 Ford made so much noise about. It's a Mazda KLDE 2.5-liter 60-degree V6 with 9.2 to 1 compression, making 164 horsepower at a rather high 6,000 RPM, and a nearly equal 160 pound-feet of torque at 4,800 RPM. This was up from earlier years of the second gen, which made 164 horsepower at 5,600 RPM and 156 pound-feet of torque at 4,800 RPM. If you had the manual transmission version, you could get to 60 miles an hour in 7 seconds if you timed your shifts just right. Top speed for the manual transmission Probe GT is 133 miles an hour and 127 miles an hour for the automatic. The KLDE engine's defining characteristic is its smoothness. If you were blindfolded in the passenger seat, you couldn't be faulted for thinking this was a rotary. And that led to some difficulty on my part in finding optimal shift points.
Again, not a good first to second. There's a happy place between first and second, and I haven't found it yet.
Yeah, I've been driving it for a long time. I think I forget. I have the learning curve on it.
Normally, we can feel through touch and sound where, in the rev range, an engine feels happy and where it wants to shift into the next gear. But the auditory and vibratory clues of the KLDE are so subtle and muted, I was missing shifts all over the place. 1997 Ford Probe GT. Who needs to do e-brake front-wheel drive one-wheel burnouts in a Paseo when you can raw dog the local noise ordinance in a Mazda-fied Ford? Once again, this is not the one that was meant to replace the Mustang. That was the first gen, but people love this tidbit and they keep bringing it up. That story was long over by the second gen, because the circumstances of the first gen were no longer evident by 1993. Yes, the first gen Ford Probe was initially conceived as a possible fourth gen Mustang, but being a fan of something basically goes hand in hand with being resistant to any change whatsoever. So Ford Mustang fans refused to accept even the idea of a Japanese engineered version without rear wheel drive or a V8. Because this was a time before enthusiasts were able to get all the negative energy out of their systems in forums and social media posts like they did with the Mach-E. This was during the heyday of Auto Alliance International, the partnership between Ford and Mazda that resulted in these partnership cars that were Fords on the outsides and Mazdas in the middle. And while I don't know that the first generation was necessarily intended to compete with import sports coupes, the second generation's design overhaul suggested something more focused and impactful. This is basically a Mazda MX-6. The guts of the engine, the suspension, and the transmission were all carried over. Ford just did some body work to tie it all together. And to the layperson, this was just a regular old Ford, without the connotation of being engineered and manufactured by a Japanese automaker. It's like when a frontman who didn't write any of the songs gets the same amount of credit from the public as the guy who actually did. Ford Probe, brought to you by Oasis. When the Probe dropped in '93, it was named Motor Trend Car of the Year, and over 119,000 units were produced, which means more of these were manufactured that model year than the Mustang, which saw about 115,000 units produced. But this 1997 model was from the final year of the Probe, and by then, production had dropped to just a little under 17,000 units, just to give some idea of how hard these fell off. Initially, there were plans to release a third generation, but by then, Ford decided they were just going to copy and paste those plans onto the new Mercury Cougar to lure the youth crowd, and they thought that was going to be what kids want, a Mercury Cougar. It's like Warren Beatty thinking yellow overcoats were going to take off after Dick Tracy. Remember Dick Tracy? I remember Dick Tracy. Normally you need to get a box of Trojans to see a dick wrapped in that much yellow, but he made it work. Somehow. And that dude was ready to play that role forever, just spending his twilight years rocking yellow and oozing aura out of every pore while he rearranges the vaginal upholstery of every lounge singer in a 10-block radius. Sorry, Warren. No one gets that kind of mileage out of a dick without a prescription. The owner, Brad, still has this probe running on the stock swirlies. These are stock wheels. This is how it came. Well, they were optional, but these are real wheels, although the suspension is lowered on K-Sport coilovers. Now these hood vents, they're from a Pontiac G6, we'll let him have that, and the front lip is from a Mustang Mach 1. Brad also mentioned that he was able to source some engine parts out of the Mazda Millennia, since it was the next best option for parts after the probe was discontinued. And look, this is what you do with a probe now in 2025. You maintain it. Because these things were trashed in the early 2000s. Oh my goodness. These cars were destroyed. More than Preludes, more than Celicas. Because these were third-tier sports coupes. Right? They got all the bad mods. People just taking air boxes off and just getting a worm drive clamp and just clamping an air filter right to the throttle body. Oh, it's a short ram intake. Nah. Drink sparks, party right. But when you have a stock probe, or as close as you can get to it, you're building on what's already there, because the ideal version of this car exists somewhere inside of it, provided you're able to bring it out with the right tasteful modifications. It's like the makeup that brings out the natural beauty of a bride on her wedding day, or an outfit that makes a dude appear slightly more PennDOT plowable on New Year's Eve. The Ford Probe was not and is not today an exotic car, but it's popular in a way that all those wreckable, raceable American cars were at a time just before the Fast and the Furious had everybody pretending they were always a gearhead and not just chasing a trend. The Ford Probe wasn't a head-turner in its own day, and by the end of its run here in 97, it did start to look antiquated because pop-up headlights were on their way. The Miata gave them up, and the MR2 was about to give them up too. It would take the Corvette a little longer, but these cute little headlights in the late 90s were just seen as a remnant of the 80s. And there's nothing more lampoonable than the previous decade, no matter what time you're in. But now, the Probe definitely gets attention because it stands out from today's monochromatic sea of similarity. But like anything worth having, a Ford Probe is something you will work at. This was a cheap car after all, and even though it's mostly a Mazda, it's built Ford cheap, and the work doesn't stop once you have it running. Or how's this for a different analogy? Snow is nice when it's falling. It's when it stops and everything gets quiet and all you're left with is the accumulation, the silence, and the knowledge that it has to be dealt with, that it becomes a chore. But then you go out, you do your shoveling, you lay down your salt, and it goes back to being nice again because you've done the work. And while you might be worn down from having done it, it's a kind of satisfied exhaustion. And now that it's no longer something that needs dealing with, you can go back to accepting the snow and whatever feeling it brings. You have to put work into making a Ford Probe what you want it to be, but you're starting out with a foundation that's better than some of its contemporaries ever got. Certainly better than the Mustang. And by that I mean the Fox body Mustang. And it shows that Ford was more than capable of making a competent sports car that was accessible to everyone, even if they were copying Mazda's homework. That's not really the case with anything that Ford makes now in 2025. The Ford Probe GT, it feels like it was built by a different Ford entirely. Well, because it kind of was. It was Ford without all the hubris. They were accepting outside ideas and outside help, and building things that were appealing but attainable, even if it was outside of Ford's typical wheelhouse. and marketed to people who were more likely to go with the competition. Every once in a while, a car company takes a swing, and while it doesn't always clear the nosebleeds, it can be worth it for the legacy of the brand to take that swing in the first place. Is a Ford Probe GT going to change global perception of Ford? No. But it can stand as a reminder of what Ford could still be capable of doing with the right push.
Do you want the old, unhinged regular car reviews? Find it on Patreon. We have an entire alternate take of this Ford Probe review that I can't even show a preview for. It's that dirty. That's on Patreon right now. But what I can give you a preview for is Regular Friends Podcast. That's on Patreon as well. Here's us hanging out with the chair of Philadelphia, Drain, and the head of security, Frey. Come join all the fun on Patreon. It's all the fun of old regular car reviews, where no one can tell us what we can't do.
I had a guy come up to me before Philadelphia. You're our guest of honor. Came up and he said, "Oh, so you got Mr. Regular from Regular Car Reviews as your guest of honor this year, huh?" And I was like, "Yeah, he's a friend. He lives close by. Like, we thought he'd be cool." And he goes, "Yeah. I used to RP with that guy back in the day on F-List." And I was like,
Okay, go on.
I was like, okay. And he started going on. And I just remember sitting there. And at some point I just opened my mouth and I was like, I don't think that you should be telling me any of this. I was like, I kind of feel like this is really personal. And you shouldn't be telling me this information. And the guy was like,
It's that classic Spectrum thing of, if something is true,
dude,
then I can say it.
It's like, oh, hey, you know that guy? Yeah, I know that guy. Yeah, I know every single one of his fetishes. Brian.
It's hyper and vacuum pumping. Yeah. I talked about pumping.
Hyper pumping.
Dude, I've talked
eggs,
about
something about eggs. Was there eggs involved?
Birds, the eggs.
Birds and dragons.
I was just like, dude, he started being like, yeah, that guy is really into this. He's really into this. He's really into this.
All down a notch.
We're getting drunk and loud now.
Oh my God.